The morning sun peeked through the kitchen window as Audora's tired hands moved mechanically through her tasks. 5 years ago, this same kitchen had been filled with laughter and warm conversations. Now, at 6 a.m., only the sound of eggs sizzling in the pan and her own heavy sighs filled the air. In the living room, her husband Chuki sat scrolling through his phone, the blue light reflecting off his face. He hadn't noticed the dark circles under his wife's eyes, growing deeper with each passing day. He hadn't seen how her shoulders slumped a little more every morning as she prepared yet another breakfast for his mother, who would sleep until mid-morning, long after Audora left for work. "Mommy, I can't find my other sock," 8-year-old Chimdi called from upstairs. "Check under your bed, sweetheart," Audora replied, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. She glanced at the clock. 20 minutes to get the children to school, and she still needed to pack their lunches. From the guest room, she could hear her mother-in-law's gentle snoring. It had been 3 weeks since Mama arrived, and each day felt longer than the last. The older woman's presence loomed over the house like a heavy cloud, bringing with it expectations as thick as the morning fog outside. Audora's hands trembled slightly as she flipped the eggs. She remembered how different things had been in the beginning. How Chuki used to stand beside her in this very kitchen, helping with dinner, both of them dancing to the radio. Now he barely looked up from his phone, even as their home life crumbled around them. "The eggs are burning," Chuki commented without looking up, his thumb continuing its endless scroll. Something inside Audora cracked, as quiet as a hairline fracture in fine china, but just as irreparable. She stared at the burning eggs, watching them turn black around the edges. In that moment, she saw her marriage doing the same, burning slowly while everyone watched, no one moving to save it. Upstairs, she could hear their daughter Yuna helping Chimdi look for his sock. Even the children had learned to fend for themselves, sensing their mother's overwhelming burden. They had grown quieter, more self-reliant, in ways that children shouldn't have to be. The morning routine continued its relentless march. Uniforms straightened, bags packed, shoes tied. Through it all, Chuki remained on the couch, offering occasional unhelpful comments, while his mother's expectations hung in the air like an unspoken command. As Adora rushed the children out the door, she caught a glimpse of herself in the hallway mirror. Behind her reflection, she could see into the living room where Chuki still sat, unbothered by the morning chaos. In the guest room, his mother would soon wake, expecting a hot breakfast and unlimited attention. Audora's hand rested on the front door handle. In that quiet moment, as her children waited on the porch, she felt something shift inside her. It wasn't anger anymore. It was something deeper, more final. Like the last leaf falling from an autumn tree, she felt the last of her hope drift away. She didn't know it yet, but tomorrow morning would be different. Tomorrow, she would make a choice that would shake their carefully constructed world to its foundation. But for now, she simply closed the door behind her, the sound echoing through the house like a warning bell that everyone, somehow, failed to hear. That evening, Audora stood at the kitchen sink, her reflection fractured in the soap bubbles floating on dirty dishwater. The weight in her chest had grown heavier throughout the day, pressing against her ribs like a physical thing. Behind her, she could hear her mother-in-law's voice drifting from the living room, mixing with the sound of Chuki's favorite TV show. "In my time," Mama was saying, her voice carrying that familiar note of criticism, "women knew how to manage their homes without complaining. Now everyone wants a housekeeper." Adora's hands tightened on the sponge she was holding. She had asked Chuki about hiring help just that morning, after feeling dizzy from exhaustion. The memory of his response still stung. In the living room, Chuki laughed at something on TV, as if his mother hadn't just taken another jab at his wife. The children were upstairs doing homework. They had learned to retreat early these days, sensing the tension that filled the house like smoke. Taking a deep breath, Audora dried her hands and walked into the living room. She had rehearsed this conversation in her head all day, trying to find the right words. "Chuki," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "we need to talk about getting some help around the house." Her mother-in-law clicked her tongue, but Audora kept her eyes on her husband. Chuki didn't even look up from the TV screen. "We've talked about this," he said, reaching for the remote to turn up the volume. "Only lazy women need housekeepers. My mother raised 5 children without help. The words hit Audora like a physical blow. She looked at her mother-in-law, who sat smugly in her armchair, then back at her husband, who still hadn't bothered to meet her eyes. I work full-time, Audora said, her voice trembling slightly. I take care of the children, the cooking, the cleaning. I'm exhausted, Chuki. I need help. Finally, Chuki turned to face her. But instead of concern, his face showed only annoyance. How hard can it be? He asked, gesturing vaguely at the house. It's just 2 children and some housework. Why are you always complaining? In that moment, something shifted in Audora's heart. She could feel it, like a door quietly closing, or a light being switched off. Her hand unconsciously moved to her stomach, where a secret was growing that she hadn't yet shared with anyone. From upstairs came the sound of Chimdi asking Yuna for help with his math homework. Even the children had learned to rely on each other, instead of disturbing the tense atmosphere downstairs. You don't see me, Adora whispered, more to herself than to Chuki. But he heard her. What's that supposed to mean? He asked, finally putting down his phone. But Adora was already turning away, heading toward the stairs. Nothing, she said quietly. You've made yourself very clear. Her mother-in-law's satisfied humming followed her up the stairs. Adora paused at the children's room, watching them work together at their small desk. They looked up and smiled at her, and she felt her heart crack a little more. In their bedroom, Adora sat on the edge of the bed, her hand still resting on her stomach. The distance between her and Chuki had grown so vast, she couldn't see a way to bridge it anymore. Not with his mother acting as gatekeeper, not with his blindness to her struggles, and certainly not with a new baby on the way. As she sat there in the growing darkness, Adora began to plan. She thought about the emergency fund she'd been quietly building, about her sister's empty guest room in the next town, about the doctor's appointment she'd scheduled for tomorrow. Most of all, she thought about survival, hers and her unborn child's. Downstairs, she could hear Chuki and his mother laughing at the TV show, their voices floating up like nothing was wrong, like her world wasn't crumbling around her. But Adora knew. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, she would choose herself. The morning Adora left, dawn had barely touched the sky. She moved through the quiet house like a shadow, her small bag packed with only the essentials. In the children's room, she paused to watch them sleep, memorizing their peaceful faces. Chimdi had kicked off his blanket again, and she gently covered him one last time. Chuki woke 2 hours later to an unusually quiet house. No smell of breakfast, no sound of children getting ready, no gentle hustle of his wife's morning routine. At first, he simply checked his phone, assuming Adora was running late. When his mother's voice rang out from the guest room, the reality of the situation began to sink in. Where is my breakfast? Mama called, her voice cutting through the morning silence. Adora, the sun is already up. Chuki found himself standing in the kitchen, staring at the cold stove. His phone showed no messages, and Adora's number went straight to voicemail. The children were still asleep. Usually, they would have been dressing and ready for school by now. What do you mean she's gone? His mother demanded when he told her, her face twisting with disapproval. Gone where? What kind of woman abandons her home like this? The smell of burning filled the air as Chuki attempted to make breakfast. He had never paid attention when Adora cooked. It had always seemed so simple when she did it. Now, as he scraped blackened plantains into the trash, sweat beading on his forehead, he began to understand just how much he had taken for granted. Daddy, where's Mommy? Chimdi asked, appearing in the kitchen doorway in his wrinkled uniform. And why does it smell like something's burning? Yuna stood behind her brother, her eyes scanning the kitchen. She was old enough to understand that something was wrong. Did Mom leave because of Grandma? She asked directly, her young face serious. Don't be ridiculous. Mama snapped from her seat at the table. Your mother is just being dramatic. She'll come crawling back when she realizes how foolish she's being. But as the morning wore on, the house descended into chaos. Chuki couldn't find the children's school shoes. Their lunch boxes were empty. Yuna's hair wasn't properly braided. The kitchen looked like a war zone, and his shirt was soaked with sweat. We're late for school, Dad, Yuna said quietly, watching him struggle with Chimdy's tie. Her own uniform was wrinkled, and her hair was barely combed. Chuki's head was pounding. His mother's constant complaints about Adora's absence felt like hammer blows against his skull. The children's questions about their mother twisted like knives in his chest. And somewhere, in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered that this was all his fault. "Mama, please." He finally snapped when his mother started another tirade about modern wives. "Just, please." The silence that followed was deafening. His mother's mouth hung open in shock. He had never raised his voice to her before. But looking at the chaos around him, at his confused and poorly prepared children, at the mess in the kitchen, something inside him cracked. That evening, after a desperate day of juggling work and the children's needs, Chuki sat alone in the living room. His phone lay silent on the table. Still no word from Adora. The house felt eerily empty without her presence. Even the walls seemed to echo with her absence. In the kitchen, dishes from breakfast still sat in the sink. His mother had made no move to help, instead spending the day sighing dramatically and making pointed comments about ungrateful wives. The children had gone to bed early, both unusually quiet, both asking the same question: when is mommy coming home? Chuki didn't have an answer for them. Looking around at the disorder that had descended in just one day without Adora, he began to understand the weight she had carried. Every clean dish, every pressed uniform, every packed lunch, every braided hair. They had all been pieces of a puzzle he had never bothered to see. As he finally dragged himself to bed, the sheets still rumpled from the morning, Chuki realized something that filled him with dread. Tomorrow would be exactly the same, and the day after that, and he had no idea how to handle it. A week after Adora's departure, Chuki came home to find a young woman sitting in his living room. She sat with perfect posture, hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes downcast in a show of respect. His mother beamed beside her like a proud merchant showcasing her finest goods. "This is Alma," Mama announced, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "A proper village girl. She knows how to take care of a home, unlike that other one who abandoned her duties." Alma stood and bowed slightly, her movements graceful and practiced. "I will serve your family well, sir," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Something in Chuki's chest tightened at the word serve, but his mother was already talking about Alma's qualities, about her traditional upbringing, about how she would bring peace back to their home. Too exhausted from a week of domestic chaos to argue, he simply nodded. The change was immediate. The next morning, Chuki woke to the smell of fresh bread and properly cooked plantains. The children's uniforms were pressed, their shoes polished, their bags packed. Even his own clothes were laid out, perfectly ironed. Alma moved through the house like an efficient ghost, anticipating needs before they were spoken. "You see?" his mother said smugly over a perfectly prepared breakfast. "This is how a proper home should run." But while the adults smiled over their morning tea, Eunice sat silently, pushing food around her plate. Chimdy kept looking at the empty chair where their mother used to sit, his small face troubled. Days turned into weeks. The house ran like clockwork under Alma's care. Everything was clean, every meal was on time, every task was completed without complaint. Yet somehow, the house felt colder than ever. "I miss Mommy's songs," Chimney whispered one night as Alma tucked him in. She used to make funny voices when she read stories. Alma's hand paused on the blanket. For a moment, something flickered across her face, something that looked almost like understanding. But she simply smoothed the covers and turned out the light. The breaking point came on a hot afternoon, when Mama decided to test her authority. She walked into the kitchen where Alma was preparing dinner, carrying a basket of laundry. "These need to be washed and ironed before evening," Mama announced, dropping the basket at Alma's feet. "Make sure you do the collars properly this time." Alma stood very still, her hands covered in flour from the bread she was kneading. She looked at the laundry, then at Mama, then at her own hands. "I just finished cleaning the house and cooking dinner," she said quietly. "Could I perhaps do the laundry tomorrow?" Mama's face darkened. "What did you say? Are you refusing to do what you're told?" "No, Mama," Alma replied, her voice still soft, but with an edge that hadn't been there before. "I'm asking for reasonable time to complete my tasks." Reasonable time? Mama scoffed. In my day, we didn't make excuses. We just did what needed to be done. Something changed in Alma's face then, like a mask slipping off to reveal something harder underneath. Without a word, she wiped her hands on her apron, picked up the basket of clothes, and walked to the backyard. The smell of smoke drew everyone outside minutes later. There, in the yard, Mama's clothes burned in a bright pile, with Alma standing calmly beside the flames. Have you lost your mind? Mama screamed, rushing forward. No, Alma said, her voice clear and strong now. I found it. I came here to work, not to be a slave. I'm not your puppet, and I won't let you treat me like one. Chuki, who had just returned from work, stood frozen in the doorway. The scene before him felt surreal. The burning clothes, his mother's red face, Alma's quiet defiance. But most striking was how familiar it all felt. Hadn't Adora stood in this same yard, suffering under these same expectations, burning not with fire, but with unspoken resentment? You ungrateful girl, Mama sputtered. After everything I've done for you, everything you've done? Alma laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. You brought me here to replace a woman you broke. You thought I would be your perfect puppet because I'm from the village. But let me tell you something, Mama. Women are not your toys, whether they're from the city or the village. The children watched from the window, their faces pressed against the glass. In Alma's defiance, Una saw an echo of her mother's quiet strength. In the burning clothes, Chimdi saw the end of another false peace. That evening, Alma packed her bags, just as Adora had done weeks before. But unlike Adora's quiet departure, Alma faced them all in the living room. Find another woman to destroy, she said to Chuki, her voice firm. I won't be part of this. As the door closed behind her, the house fell into a silence heavier than any that had come before. In that moment, surrounded by the lingering smell of smoke and his mother's angry muttering, Chuki finally understood. The problem had never been Adora, and it had never been Alma. The problem was much closer to home. After Alma's departure, the silence in the house felt different, heavier, like the air before a storm. Chuki stood in the living room, the smell of smoke still lingering in the air, and watched his mother arrange herself on the couch as if nothing had changed. Well, Mama said, smoothing her wrapper, we'll find someone better. Someone who knows her place. No, the word came out of Chuki's mouth with a force that surprised even him. No more Mama. His mother's face froze mid-sentence. What did you say? I said no more. Chuki's voice grew stronger with each word. You need to leave. The ceiling fan whirred above them, its shadows spinning across the floor. From upstairs came the sound of Chimdi and Una whispering, likely pressed against their bedroom door, listening. Leave? Mama's laugh was sharp. Have you lost your mind? I am your mother. Yes, you are my mother. Chuki took a deep breath. But this is my home, my family, and you've destroyed it. The truth of those words hit him like physical blows as he spoke them. His home, once warm with Adora's laughter and the children's joy, had become a cold, mechanical place under his mother's influence. First, she had driven away his wife, then Amma, all in the name of tradition, of proper behavior, of knowing one's place. I've destroyed nothing. Mama stood up, her face darkening. I've only tried to maintain order in this house. To teach that wife of yours. Teach her what, Mama? Chuki's voice rose. To be miserable, to suffer in silence, to work herself to death while I sat here, blind to everything. The children's door creaked open upstairs. Little feet padded to the railing, but neither adult looked up. You've always been a good son, Mama said, her voice taking on the wounded tone that had always worked before. Are you choosing that ungrateful woman over your own mother? Chuki looked around the room, at the spotless floors that Adora had mopped every day without complaint, at the family photos she had carefully arranged, at the children's school books still neatly stacked on the side table. Everything in this house bore the mark of her care, her love, her endless work. This isn't about choosing, Mama. This is about seeing. Really seeing. His voice softened. And I see now what I've done. What we've done. He walked to the front door and opened it. The evening air rushed in, cool and fresh, clearing away the lingering smoke. I'll help you pack, he said quietly. I'll arrange a car to take you home. I'll send money every month. But you cannot stay here anymore. You cannot do this to me. Mama's voice rose to a shriek. I am your mother. You owe me. I owe my children their mother. Chuki cut in. I owe my wife the respect and support I promised her. And I owe myself the chance to be a better man than I've been. Upstairs, Yuna hugged Chimdi close, tears rolling down both their faces. But for the first time in weeks, they were tears of hope. The next few hours passed in a blur of slammed doors and angry muttering as Mama packed her things. When the car finally arrived to take her away, she stood in the doorway, making one last attempt. You'll regret this, she said, her voice trembling with anger and hurt. When that woman refuses to come back, you'll see I was right. Chuki helped load her bags into the car. Maybe she won't come back, Mama, but that won't make you right. It will only prove how badly I failed her. As the car drove away, Chuki felt something shift inside him, like a heavy weight lifting, leaving room for something new to grow. He turned to find his children standing in the doorway, watching him with uncertain eyes. Are you going to find Mommy now? Chimdi asked, his small voice full of hope. Yes, Chuki said, really looking at his children for the first time in weeks. He saw their wrinkled clothes, their untidy hair, the shadows under their eyes. But first, we need to fix some things here. That night, Chuki sat at the kitchen table with a notebook, writing down everything Adora had managed each day. As the list grew longer and longer, his respect grew deeper. By the time he finished, the sun was rising, and he had a plan. He would search for Adora, yes, but first, he would learn. Learn to care for his home, his children, himself. Learn to be the partner she had needed all along. And maybe, just maybe, when he found her, he would be worthy of a second chance. Months had passed since Mama's departure. The house had settled into a new rhythm. Imperfect but honest. Each morning, Chuki woke before dawn to prepare breakfast and pack lunches. His eggs were often slightly burnt, and the children's hair was never quite as neat as when Adora did it, but they managed. The laundry piled up faster than he could handle it. The floors needed mopping more often than he realized. Every day brought new challenges that made him understand, with growing clarity, just how much Adora had managed alone. On this particular evening, Chuki sat in his quiet living room, exhaustion seeping into his bones. He had just finished helping Chimdi with his homework while simultaneously trying to iron uniforms for the next day. The iron had left a slight scorch mark on Yuna's skirt, and he was trying to figure out how to fix it when his phone rang. Mr. Chuki? An unfamiliar voice said. This is Dr. Wu from St. Mary's Hospital. His heart stopped. In all the scenarios he had imagined finding Adora, this had never been one of them. Your wife, Adora, has just given birth to a healthy baby boy. The iron clattered to the floor. What? He whispered, his voice barely audible. She's been under our care for several months, the doctor continued. High-risk pregnancy. She checked herself in when she first found out, saying she needed to avoid any form of stress. The room spun around him. Pregnant. Adora had been pregnant when she left. All those mornings of exhaustion, the dizziness she had complained about, her plea for help with the housework. It hadn't just been about the daily burden. She had been carrying their child. Is she? His voice cracked. Are they okay? Both mother and baby are doing well, the doctor assured him. Your wife has given permission for us to contact you. Without another word, Chuki grabbed his keys. He paused only long enough to call his sister to watch the children before racing to the hospital, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. The hospital corridors seemed endless. When he finally reached Adora's room, he stopped at the doorway, his heart pounding. There she was, looking tired but peaceful, cradling a tiny bundle wrapped in blue. The sight brought him to his knees. I didn't know, he whispered, tears streaming down his face. All this time, I didn't know. Adora looked up at him, her eyes unreadable. You never asked, she said softly. You never saw. The baby made a small sound, and Adora adjusted the blanket. Chuki remained on his knees, afraid to come closer, afraid he had lost the right to this moment. I understand now, he said, his voice breaking. These months without you, I've learned what it means to carry a home alone. But you carried so much more. He told her about his mother's departure, about his struggles with housework, about the children's resilience. With each word, he saw something shift in Adora's eyes. The children? She asked, her voice catching. They miss you every day. Chimdi still asks for your funny bedtime stories. Una keeps your picture under her pillow. He paused. We all need you, but not like before. Not as our servant, but as our heart. Adora studied him for a long moment. Things would have to be different, she said finally. I won't go back to drowning. I've already hired a housekeeper, Chuki said quickly. She starts next month. But first, I want to prove to you that I understand. Let me handle everything for another month. Let me show you that I've changed. The baby stirred again, and this time, Adora gestured for Chuki to come closer. As he approached, she pulled back the blanket slightly, revealing their son's tiny face. His name is Oluwanifemi, she said softly. It means God loves me. Chuki looked at his son, then at his wife. In her eyes, he saw not just the exhausted woman who had left months ago, but the strong person who had chosen to protect herself and their unborn child. The woman who had forced him to confront his failures and grow. 1 month, Adora said finally. Show me. As he sat beside her bed, watching their son sleep, Chuki understood that this wasn't just a second chance at his marriage. It was a chance to build something new, something stronger, fairer, and more beautiful than before. This time, he wouldn't just be a husband who provided. He would be a true partner, a present father, a man who understood that love wasn't just about feeling, but about doing. Outside the hospital window, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of hope. In the quiet room, 3 hearts beat together, starting a new chapter in their story. 1 year later, the morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows, illuminating a scene very different from those tense days of the past. Chuki stood at the stove, expertly flipping pancakes, while baby Oluwanifemi watched from his high chair, giggling at his father's exaggerated cooking movements. Don't forget Una likes blueberries in hers. Adora called from the living room, where she was helping Chimdi practice for his school presentation. Her voice carried no strain, no hidden exhaustion, just warmth and the simple joy of a shared morning. The housekeeper, Mrs. Amina, hummed quietly as she folded laundry nearby. She had been with them for 8 months now, her presence neither a replacement nor a solution, but part of the family's new way of sharing responsibilities. Daddy, is my lunch packed? Una asked, bouncing into the kitchen with her freshly braided hair, done by Chuki himself, who had spent countless YouTube hours learning to style his daughter's hair. Check the blue container in your bag, he replied, sliding a perfectly golden pancake onto her plate. Mrs. Amina helped me prepare it last night. The house moved with an easy rhythm now. Gone were the days of single-handed struggles and silent resentment. Instead, there was a dance of shared duties, of helping hands and grateful hearts. Adora walked into the kitchen, carrying a confident Chimdi who had just nailed his presentation practice. Her eyes met Chuki's across the room, and they shared a smile that spoke of hard lessons learned and bridges carefully rebuilt. Remember when you couldn't even boil water? She teased, accepting the cup of tea he handed her. Remember when I thought managing a home was not that hard? He replied, shaking his head at his past ignorance. The children giggled, old enough now to understand the changes their family had gone through. Una no longer kept her mother's picture under her pillow. Instead, she had a new photo on her desk, showing all of them together at Oluwanifemi's christening, their faces bright with genuine joy. Mrs. Amina gathered her things, preparing to leave for the day. Unlike Amma, she worked regular hours, was fairly compensated, and was treated with respect, not as a replacement for anyone's responsibilities, but as a valued support to the family. Will you be cooking dinner tonight, sir? Or shall I prepare something before I leave? She asked Chuki. It's my turn tonight, he replied. But thank you. See you tomorrow. As the children finished their breakfast and gathered their school things, Adora watched her husband move through the morning routine with practiced ease. The man who once sat scrolling through his phone now packed lunches, checked homework, and tied shoelaces without being asked. Mama called yesterday, he mentioned casually as he wiped Oluwanifemi's messy face. She wanted to visit. Adora tensed slightly, but Chuki continued. I told her she's welcome for day visits, but she needs to respect our boundaries. No more than a few hours at a time, and she stays in a hotel. The confidence in his voice, the certainty of protecting their peace, made Adora's heart swell. This was the partner she had needed all along, not perfect, but present, aware, and willing to grow. Later that evening, after the children were in bed, Adora and Chuki sat on their back porch. Oluwanifemi slept peacefully in his mother's arms, while his father gently rocked the chair. Do you ever regret leaving? Chuki asked softly, the question he'd held inside for so long. Adora looked at their sleeping son, then at their peaceful home. I regret that it had to come to that, she said thoughtfully. But no, I don't regret leaving. Sometimes you have to break something completely to build it back stronger. The evening breeze carried the scent of Adora's garden, the one she now had time to tend, a small luxury she'd never imagined possible before. Inside, they could hear the quiet hum of the dishwasher that Chuki had loaded after dinner, and the gentle whir of the washing machine that Mrs. Amina would empty tomorrow. We're better now, Chuki said, not a question but a grateful acknowledgement. We are, Adora agreed, because now we both understand that love isn't just about feeling or providing. It's about seeing each other, really seeing, and choosing to share the load. As night settled over their home, the lights inside glowed warm and inviting. This was no longer a battlefield of words or a prison of expectations. It had become what they had always dreamed of, a sanctuary built on understanding, maintained by shared effort, and filled with the kind of love that grows stronger through challenges overcome together. In the nursery, Oluwanifemi's mobiles turned slowly, casting gentle shadows on the wall. Below it sat a framed quote that Adora had chosen. The strongest homes are built by many hands. Their home was proof of that truth, not perfect, but perfectly theirs, strengthened by the storms they had weathered, and illuminated by the love they had learned to express not just in words, but in actions.